If you followed me from the inception of my TikTok, then you've no doubt heard about me prattle on about the battles between the ancient Greeks and the Persians, a people dedicated to defending their homeland so they can immediately go back to fighting one another again, versus conquerors hell-bent on adding another addition to their vast empire. But the Greeks were not the only rivals of the Persian Empire, for the Persians had another rivalry, this one far older, Tomyris, the Queen of the Massagetae. Daddy's talking, and he wants to talk about his sponsor. So he wants to talk about himself. Yes, I know, okay, another episode about sponsors. It's like the female orgasm, okay? You've got to build up to it, and we just ain't quite there yet. But if you'd like to support me personally, you can do so via Patreon, where you can get regular updates on projects I'm working on, sneak peeks at projects that are coming up, and access to videos 48 hours early. You can also buy my book. I really need time to finish the sequel. But you can buy the first one. If none of that takes your fancy, you can buy my merch. Which, yes, is an indirect way of having my moustache rub against you. Lastly, the best way to support me is just to like, subscribe, and share. Just to get my stuff out there. We're nearly at 1k on YouTube. Not quite caught up to TikTok numbers yet, but we're getting there. Okay, now it's time for me to shut up and get on with the video. The steppe is a long yet narrow region stretching from the Danube River in the west all the way to China in the east. The region is locked in with Siberian forests in the north, and to the south, deserts, mountains and inland seas. Humans struggled to survive in this endless sea of grass until around 3500 BCE, when we began to domesticate horses. This granted access to an unclaimed expanse as people began crossing the steppe with ease. The domestication of horses also allowed us to keep larger herds of other domesticated animals and maintain them. As with any sort of ancient people, we don't 100% know where the Scythians came from as a culture. Luckily for us, the true daddy of history, the ancient Greek historian Herodotus,
my name is Herodotus,
postulated that Heracles had a son with a serpent woman named Scythes. This child would go on to become the first Scythian king. A more scientific explanation can be found in the Andronovo culture, which was found in the steppe around 2000 BCE. Whether this culture evolved into the Scythians or the Scythians came in, conquered and or assimilated them is unknown. However, we do know that around 1000 BCE the Scythians lived east of the Altai Mountains. However, these horse lords would quickly move west and establish themselves in Inner Eurasia. They would even conquer and displace the people known as the Cimmerians around 900 BCE. The Scythians would be described in both Greek and Chinese sources as pale, with light eyes and red hair. Their clothing was decorative, dyed with vibrant colours and embroidered with complex patterns. The men would dress in thick, wool-insulated sheepskin coats that would be held at the waist by belts. These belts were then decorated with either gold, bronze, bone or wood. The women would dress in a similar fashion to the men, because the steppe is still quite cold, and they don't want to literally freeze their tits off. Both the men and women would wear rather unique headgear, like felted wool caps, or pointed hats like the gnomes in your nan's garden. The Scythians were also talented craftsmen. Always being on the move, they needed to be. These versatile people could work with leather, bone, bronze, silver, iron, wood, and even gold. All of this was created in the Scythian animal style. It's called this because it's based off of, well, well, animals, such as stags, wolves, horses, wild cats, bears, birds, and mythical creatures as well. These designs were more likely held off for the Scythian elite and were commonly found on crowns, headpieces, earrings, combs, and belts. Tattoos were also a unisex way of expressing yourself amongst the Scythians. These would be injected under the skin using soot and bone needles. These patterns could depict mythical monsters or predatory animals hunting their prey, and they were most likely administered to warriors as we administer medals to our soldiers today. Alternatively, they may have been for some kind of spiritual protection. The Scythian language was probably in the Old Eastern Iranian language family, which would make them distant cousins of the Old Persian language. Now, as they were a nomadic people, they did spend an awful lot of time travelling along the steppe in large convoys. The women would travel in large covered wagons, while the men herded the livestock whilst riding on horseback.
Like a panther.
They would normally settle on the grassland near a water source, then repeat the cycle, relying mostly on the meat and milk from their livestock for sustenance. Without any real sources of wood, it's okay fellas, the average is 5 to 6 inches. The Scythians often used animal bones and feces to roast their meat. Flavoursome. Because the Scythians were human, they also liked having a sesh and would drink a fermented alcohol made from mare's milk. They're also impartial to a certain green plant. They would burn it in a massive pit so that everybody could get groovy, man. Yet, because of a lack of written sources from them, we don't really know much about their social hierarchy. However, it is a safe guess to assume that they followed a system of warriors, priests and commoners, much like other Indo-European societies at the time. Although living what could be considered a harsher life on the steppe, Scythian women enjoyed a lot more freedom than those in settled societies. This equality was even seen on the battlefield, with the Greeks noting the ferocity that Scythian women fought with. This is what we call foreshadowing. In time, these warrior women would become associated with the Amazonian warriors of Greek myth. Now, the Scythians weren't really empire builders, and they may have inhabited large stretches of land, but they lived more in tribal confederations in which, at one point or another, one tribe would rise above the rest to become the sort of hegemon. Now, as you've probably guessed, sadly, not many structures were actually left behind by the Scythians because of their nomadic lifestyles. But like many cultures, they did leave one thing behind. Burial mounds. In fact, most preserved Scythian artefacts have been discovered by archaeologists within these burial mounds. Like many cultures around the world, kings and chiefs would be buried with riches, slaves, and of course horses. Much like the horse lords who would come after them, the Scythians were a warring people. And of course this warfare relied in a large part to the Scythian cavalry's ability to literally run rings around the armies of the civilized world. It was in this style of combat that the Scythians would perfect the horse archer unit, getting it several turns before everybody else. They would use the Scythian composite bow as their primary weapon, made from wood, horn and sinew. I don't know what sinew is and I'm scared to Google it. Even though they trained with a bow from the second they could walk, these warriors weren't just deadly at a distance. In fact, they had a variety of short-range weaponry available at a moment's notice. They would use an akimaki as a type of short sword, a type of dagger, as well as battle axes and spears, which would be used as more of an early lance. The Scythians would engage with various campaigns in the Caucasus and the Middle East between 670 BCE and 612 BCE. They would absolutely annihilate the kingdom of Tartu. The annihilation was so bad that I can't even pronounce the name properly. They would also bring the Assyrian Empire to heel. In fact, the Scythian king Medes would push his way all the way down to Egypt. When Pharaoh Psamtik I saw this large horde of mounted warriors coming towards him, he decided it was much more sensible to pay the king and his horde a decent sum of money to go in the other direction. In 612 BCE, the Scythians and their Iranian cousins the Medes came together because they decided the Assyrians hadn't had enough of a bad time and decided to sack their capital city of Nineveh. However, this wasn't the only thing to crumble, as the Medes almost immediately betrayed the Scythians after the victory, turning the alliance into a rivalry. Now, you may notice I've referenced Greek sources a couple of times so far in this video, and that's because the Greeks and the Scythians had a unique bond. The two cultures would merge in places, creating Greco-Scythian artwork, which blended the humanistic forms of the Greek world and the animal style utilised by the Scythians. This semi-cultural merging would spread across the Ponto-Caspian steppe and even have an effect on the armour of the region. It was also common to see Scythians working as bodyguards in Athens, according to the Greek historian Thucydides. I've definitely fluffed that name. However, the Greeks and the Scythians weren't always buddy-buddy. For in 339 BCE, the man who would lay the foundation for Alexander's campaigns, Philip II of Macedon, would find himself coming to blows with a man known as Attius. Philip would end the encounter with a decisive victory, Attius dead and his tribal confederation absolutely shattered. Although they did share an overarching culture, these tribes were not a united people. The image we now see is the Scythians mainly settled on the western steppe. On the eastern steppe, the Saka would settle. However, on the central steppe, the Massagetae could be found, ruling a region that in the modern day would be part of Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. In fact, everyone's favourite, Herodotus,
My name is Herodotus.
shared some thoughts on the Massagetae. In their dress and mode of living, the Massagetae resemble the Scythians. They fight both on horseback and on foot. Neither method is strange to them. They use bows and lances, but their favourite weapon is the battle axe. Their arms are either all of gold or brass. For their spear points and arrowheads, and for their battle axes, they make use of brass. For headgear, belts and girdles of gold. So too with the comparison of their horses. They give them breastplates of brass but employ gold about the reins, the bit and cheek plates. They use neither iron nor silver, having none in their country, but they have brass and gold in abundance. Herodotus notes various differences between the Massagetae and the Scythians, including that every man has one wife, but each wife is held in common. End-of-life care was also important to the Massagetae, as elderly men would be offered up as sacrifice alongside cattle. The flesh then boiled and eaten. Cyrus II, also known as Cyrus the Great, was the man who had defeated the Lydians, the Babylonians and the Medians to form the Achaemenid Empire. He proudly received tributes from Scythian tribes and even hired Scythian mercenaries, but a great many resisted. According to Herodotus, Tomyris would take the throne after the sad death of her husband, although another version of the story sees Tomyris as the only child of the leader of the Massagetae, Spargapsis. She then inherited the throne after his death. Some other stories also speak of how she cleverly got to choose her own husband. You see, there was a competition for her hand, and the competition was simple. You had to catch her on her horse. Except Tomyris was the best rider of the Massagetae, so only the best could catch her.
Clever girl.
Whatever the case, she was still in a period of mourning for the loss of her husband when a proposal came from Cyrus the Great. Now, Tomyris knew that a marriage to Cyrus would give her lands and her people to him, so she refused. Cyrus the Great was furious, handling rejection about as well as an Essex girl in a nightclub. He readied his armies for war. According to Herodotus, at this moment, Tomyris gave Cyrus a powerful message. King of the Medes, cease to press this enterprise, for you cannot know if what you are doing will be of real advantage to you. Be content to rule in peace your own kingdom, and bear to see us reign over countries that are ours to govern. As, however, I know you will not choose to hearken this counsel, since there is nothing less you desirous than peace and quietness, Come now, if you are so mightily desirous of the meeting of the Massagetae in arms, leave your useless toil of bridge-making, let us retire 3 days' march from the riverbank, and do you come across with your soldiers, or, if you like better to give us battle on your side of the stream, retire yourself an equal distance. Croesus, one of Cyrus's advisors, advised him against retreating back 3 days, as it would make him look weak to give ground to a woman.
I mean, that's sexist.
So, Cyrus decided to meet Tomyris in her land. But Cyrus decided not to meet her in open combat. Instead, he left a meagre force of Persians for the Massagetae to rip into. These were easily defeated, and Massagetae army found stores of food and wine. Now, being used to drinking horse juice alcohol, the wine had a pretty powerful effect on the Massagetae. Once they were drunk enough, the Persians came in and slaughtered the drunken masses, capturing many, including Tomyris' son, Spargapesis. Now, if you've seen a single nature documentary in your life, you know that there is no fury on this planet like a mother when her child is in danger, as Cyrus would find out when he received this message. You bloodthirsty Cyrus, pride not yourself on this poor success. It was the grape juice, which, when you drink it, makes you so mad, and as you swallow it down, brings up to your lips such bold and wicked words. It was this poison by which you ensnared my child, and so overcame him, not in fair open fight. Now, hear what I advise, and be sure I advise you for your good. Restore my son to me, and get you from the land unharmed, triumphant over a third part of the host of the Massagetae. Refuse, and I swear by the sun, the sovereign lord of the Massagetae, bloodthirsty as you are, I will give you your fill of blood. Spargapesis soon recovered from his drunken stupor and begged Cyrus for freedom. Cyrus obliged, but the young man was humiliated and took his own life. Definitely wasn't killed by the guy who invaded the lands of the Massagetae because he got rejected. Upon hearing the news of her son's death, Tomyris gathered every single force she could find in the kingdom and gave Cyrus the battle that will be described by Herodotus as, of all the combats in which the barbarians have engaged among themselves, I reckon this to be the fiercest. The battle was so brutal that a majority of the Persian army was completely destroyed, and Cyrus the Great himself was killed. Tomyris then had Cyrus's body beheaded. Finding a skin and filling it to the brim with human blood, she dipped Cyrus's head inside, whilst saying, I live and have conquered you in fight, and yet by you am I ruined, for you took my son with guile. Thus I make good on my threat, and give you your fill of blood. And with this, Tomyris fulfilled her promise. Hell hath no fury. Whilst the Scythians would disappear into the annals of history, during the 13th century, the Alans would forge a powerful kingdom in the Caucasus, and it is believed that these people were the descendants of Tomyris and the Massagetae. This wouldn't last forever though, and in 1239 CE, the Alans would be conquered by the Mongols. Yet the warrior queen's defiance stands strong, and they remain in the region as the modern-day Ossetian people. Now these horse lords can be found in the history books of Greece, Iran, India and China, and they may not be here today, but they laid the foundations for the nomadic powerhouses that were yet to come. Although evidence of her people would begin to fade in more recent times, Tomyris would find herself amongst the 9 female worthies of the 14th century. These were a series of 9 women who showed examples of military prowess in battle. This itself was based off the original 9 worthies, which was a series of Jewish, Christian and pagan men who had achieved great things. Unlike the male figures, the female list changed depending on the author and depending on the time. However, Tomyris could find herself amongst such figures as Ethelfled, the Lady of Mercia, Boudicca, the Queen of the Iceni, and Margaret of York. Tomyris was thrust into a more mainstream position when she was featured in the Civilization series of games. It is also worth mentioning that she had her own movie, but I forgot to mention that because I'm an idiot. Anyways guys, I'll see you in the next one. Ciao.